having an intro. Thank you for not having an intro. Thank you for getting right to the point. We're having an intro. This is a show. A show, for crying out loud. And there's not gonna be any AI pictures, not gonna be any gameplay footage. Come on! Let's bring a little class back into this YouTube thing. Sheesh. In all of the countries around the world, and in all of the global powers that have come and gone, few are as impressive as the dreary little country of England. I mean, me personally, I've never even stepped foot in it. And yet here I am, a yapping head, peacocking in their language. And wherever you are, whether it be a former colony of their gigantic empire or not, you're watching me and understanding it. Or maybe you're just watching me from straight up England. If so, I'm sorry. Not sure why y'all gotta talk like that. So with that being said, if you're any kind of fan of history at all, the history of this scrappy little island nation should be of keen interest to you. I mean, like a whopping 1/3 of the planet speaks their homegrown language, right? What was England's life like in its formative years? You know, like the early life tab on Wikipedia. Avoiding the bubby as well as cracks on the knuckles from the teacher's ruler. Well, England's early years as it shaped into its identity is a fascinating case study of anthropology, with constantly changing demographics and centers of power. I feel like the layman might imagine the British person as a uniform identity, roaming the world and planting flags, tea and crumpets in hand all along the way. But in reality, the history of England is far from linear and full of strife and overlordship, with cultures based on class, ethnicity, and religion, and the boundaries of said identifiers blurred constantly by internal turmoil and foreign invasion. England emerged from its millennium of a never-ending hurricane of warfare as a hungry and imposing power player on the international stage, establishing the largest empire the world has ever seen in a couple short centuries. When interestingly, throughout most of written history, it was deemed as a land of insignificant backwardness. An origin story overshadowed by its achievements, but definitely worth taking a look at. So in part one, we're going to take a look at the history of England from when it was a Roman province up into about when the Anglo-Saxons start to arrive. But hey, this is a show, remember? So there's gonna be a few episodes and it ends with these guys named the Normans coming and taking over. I feel like that's when the early life section of this country ends and then it shifts to like education or career or something like that, you know, like Wikipedia. So please, hit subscribe and stick around. I'm so tired of being a 4-star Uber driver and a mediocre forklift operator, and I want to be an internet self-absorbed micro-celebrity. It's a bit more glamorous, you know? Okay. Oh, and I'd like to say one more thing before I kick this series off. I will be covering some very touchy subjects in this series, but I really don't mean any disrespect or disparagement to the English people. And yes, I know what that means, like the English, like the Anglo-Saxons. We'll be going over some skeletons in the closet, but history is a harsh place and everybody has those. Okay, but I will say, y'all got a lot, like low-key the most. Like, sheesh, Edward, chill out. But regardless, I feel like the norm when discussing history is the portrayal of the English as a villain that was a detriment to everybody, and the idea that pride and honor and English heritage should be minimal or something. I, however, don't feel this way at all. Where would the physical world be without your inventors? Where would the fictional world be without your writers? And where would academia be without your scholars? I benefit from this country's contributions every day, and any sort of relaying of the events of the past does not take away from that. So, with that being said, this is the H&H Show. I'm your host, Russ Snow, and this is The Origins of England, Part 1. I'd like to start off by clarifying something important, like very important, that I feel like most people don't have a very good grasp of. Okay. So pictured here, we have what is called the British Isles. No socio-political implications here, no threats and rule Wales for saying that this is the British Isles. That is just the geographical region picture. Now, let's take a closer look. You see how it's made up of 2 islands? Well, this one on the left is what is called Ireland, and this one on the right is what is called the island of Britain. Again, just a geographical distinction. No funny business, right? I mean, it is named Britain, so everyone that lives here is British, right? Well, sort of. Well, no, not really. Yes, everybody on the island is from Britain in a geographical sense, but technically speaking, only the people in regions such as Wales or Cornwall or Cumbria or other Celtic hotspots could be called British in an ethnic sense, being the most closely related to the indigenous of the island. But as stated, yes, geographically they're all from Britain. But the people of Sussex could not be called British, because then that implies they're Britannic. Hold your tongue, you ignorant outsider. Simple enough. In older academic papers and books and such, the name England is used interchangeably for the island. I mean, it's the dominant identity there, and it just kind of slips out. But yeah, about the word England and English. England and the English actually only are from this spot right here, or England could only define this spot right here. Throughout its history, places like Wales and Cornwall are periodically under English rule, but don't identify as English in a cultural sense. However, the people in this bubble pictured are in fact English. They have English history, English accents, English slang, and English customs. And this is what my series will be about. It'll be about the events that happen inside the boundaries of what we call England. British has become shorthand for English in the modern day. While it feels improper to call a Scottish person a Brit, in a technical sense it's correct. What makes it even more of a headache is that within the word British's purely ethnic implications, it's actually more accurate to say a Scot is a Brit rather than say a typical English guy from London. But outside an acidic academic paper written by a Scouser or something like that, I doubt people these days are splitting too many hairs over this. However, absolutely do not, and I mean under any circumstances, call someone from Wales English, especially if they are older, had a few drinks, and are feeling nostalgic. Please do not do that. Alright, so just a quick recap. This right here is Ireland. This island right here is Britain. This right here is Scotland. Right here is Wales. There's Cornwall. This bubble right here is England. So keep in mind that we will be talking about Roman Britain, but Roman Britain actually doesn't have anything to do with the English people. But we will be discussing the history of England from that point. And if I'm in the spirit of airing out all the messy business that gives the implications and stakes of our narrative weight, I might as well address a massive element of the region that affects it to this day. Within the British Isles, generally speaking, there are two distinct people groups living together. The people of England are largely Germanic, everyone else is largely Celtic. So, I'm sorry. If this type of thing bores you, you could skip to minute 2-bad. It's important, it's overlooked, and you need to understand this if you want to understand any sort of history of the Isle. Racial identity on the continent of Europe has radically changed in the last 200 years, especially with the introduction of nationalism and colonies. But in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, it was a wildly different affair. When people groups such as the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Vandals, and Franks were having their first initial rise to prominence, they really and truly believed to an extent that they were one and the same, or one people. The ancestors of modern day England, Germanic raiders blanketly referred to as the Anglo-Saxons, were avid members of this big, happy family. The most legendary Old English epic poem, Beowulf, is set in mainland Europe, simply referred to as the Old Lands with nonchalant familiarity. In the Anglo-Saxon poem Widsith, about an all-seeing deity named Widsith, Germanic historical figures like the Gothic kings of the migration period are referred to in an offhand way, implying an expected prior knowledge. In the Anglo-Saxon poem Dior, the story recounts 5 tales from the greater Germanic world and uses them to serve as warnings of the extent of unchecked cruelty, referring to kingdoms in faraway lands as ancestors with stories to heed. Early Franks, English, Scandinavians, and others shared very similar folklore. They all had fairies, elves, werewolves, and giants. They even shared mythical figures that had a consistent name, like Walden the Smith. Myths of the Franks' ancestors could be modeled after and depicted in art with an air of relation to, say, the Saxons, and vice versa. In northern and western Europe's formative years, most tribes and kingdoms even shared an almost identical runic alphabet, and up to 70% of surnames being the exact same from stretches as vast as England to Sweden. That is why in the early Middle Ages, Scandinavians could invade France and just kind of morph into Nordic Frenchmen, and then the Franks could then topple the Goths, and the Goths be absorbed without terrible fuss. Or for the case of England, people such as the Angles and the Saxons could be passionate patriots of their kingdoms and be willing to fall in battle for its honor, but sort of just meet in the middle when it comes to general practices, language, and religion. Yes, they are different kingdoms, different nations with different leaders and different interests. But at the end of the day, and I mean the end of the day, the very end of the day, they were brethren. The men from north of the Rhine, the conquerors of the North Sea. Brother love, group hug time. Everybody group hug, hold on. Group hug. Picture me, I'm an Anglo, and this is a Saxon. Group hug, brother love. What are you doing just standing over there? You two dames, come here. Yep, you two, you could join the group hug. That's right. There's a reason why y'all getting massacred and 1014 was controversial even then. Oh, spoilers. However, throw that all out the window once you get to Ireland. The Angles and the Saxons said they could not join the group hug at all. They had no tales of Walden the Smith and no orations of Alric the God. They had a different language, different alphabet, different customs, and a different general look. Split off from the Germanics thousands of years ago. Adversaries in conflict as far back as Julius Caesar wrote about both of them before Christ walked the earth. To the Anglo-Saxons, those are Celts. They are not separate nations. They are a separate people. And that notion stuck around up until the 1900s and is going to be the source of some messy business we touch on today. And a notion that leaves visible scars on the Isles to this very hour. The island of Britain, and subsequently the territory of England, first makes its major appearance in the history books when it becomes a province of history's main character, Rome. But there was certainly some noise and bustle before Caesar and the boys ever got there. There is archaeological evidence of civilization on the island as far back as the Upper Paleolithic period, 35,000 years ago. Matter of fact, Britain in prehistory was kind of popping off in the ye old days, with excavations showing multiple population shifts, tool usage, and so forth. Britain's most eye-catching remnant of prehistory activity is by far Stonehenge, first being constructed by a culture now lost to time and expanded on by the peoples on the island throughout the ancient days. But who are we kidding though? Aliens built Stonehenge. There's just no way ancient people built Stonehenge. Ancient people were stumbling, bumbling, clueless fools. Unlike us enlightened, smart, modern people. The culture that was prevalent in Britain in the Roman times was the greater Celtic culture. The Celts are a people group with distinctive red skin tone, freckles, light-colored eyes, and a high likelihood of orange hair that are actually native to southern Germany, funnily enough, and can first be identified as forming in approximately 800 BC. By the late BCs, they inhabited a power center in a land once named Gaul, in modern-day France. These said Celts of Gaul very famously went to war with Julius Caesar of Rome in the late BCs and were subjugated by the up-and-coming Imperator. This is when Britain received its largest number of Celtic migrants, with some of the people in the new Roman territory staying and eventually assimilating into the empire, and others fleeing to the British Isles and settling there. I assume it was the ones that couldn't get behind all the fancy schmancy Latin stuff. And gosh, all the red. It looks great when it's clean, but what if it gets dirty? But there is evidence of a strong presence of Celtic culture on the island as far back as 700 BC, only a century after the culture's nominal birth. From now on, we will simply refer to the non-Roman people that lived on the island in this time as the Britannic people, or the Britons, as that is what they were known as then. It's assumed that the escape plan was rooted in some kind of agreement between the Belgic Gauls and the Celts already living there. This is especially supported by the fact that Julius Caesar justified his venture into Britain by stating that the support that the island's southern tribes showed to Belgic Gaul during the wars was disruptive and an insult to the glorious Republic. Surely it wasn't because having conquered the ends of the known world would be a real nice thing to have on the resume in case you wanted to, I don't know, overthrow the government or something. But this video isn't about Julius Caesar. I think about that guy too much anyways. Speaking of history's favorite rude boy, he's here and gone in our story. Because while he talked big, he only had one successful landing on the island. Caesar and his men were taken aback by what they perceived as alien customs of the island's natives, as well as the weather and atmosphere to be oppressive, and they wanted to absolutely just get out of there. The chief reason being that the whole experience kind of just creeped him out. This is only somewhat of a comedic exaggeration. Britain's spooky vibes and stormy seas were really doing a number on morale. Caesar secured a hasty client kingdom relationship with a people called the Trinovantes that was purely lip service. By 54 BC, the same year the venture was started, the Romans happily picked up and skedaddled. The island's natives watched the boat disappear over the horizon and instantly went back to doing their own thing. Romans? What Romans? I told you not to bother me when it's swamp time. Hey, Katu Villa Uni? What is it, Russ? I'm gonna have to interrupt swamp time. Because the Romans gave the Britons about 100 years for their memory to marinate, and then they were back. You see, it's now 43 AD. Julius Caesar's great-great-nephew or something like that, a guy named Emperor Claudius, saw the exotic land of Britannica as a perfect proving ground for him to annex and silence all the people that were calling him a dork and shoving him into a locker. If he conquered new land for the empire on a military campaign, he finally wouldn't have to do his royal advisor's homework anymore, or have peasants in the street come up to him and be like, Emperor, oh my gosh, it's the emperor. And Claudius is like, oh, my loyal subject. And they're just like, you suck, Claudius. Like the peasants, like everybody was clowning this guy. Yes, this is the reason the island of Britain was conquered and the course of humanity altered forever. And again, only a slight comedic exaggeration. Roman history is insane. And it was all in on the Claudius the Conqueror bit, as he sent a whopping 40,000 men to crush any resistance. The Britannic tribal confederation got over their differences and held out as long as they could, but that was not long at all. Very few things in the ancient world would be able to do much about the tidal wave of 40,000 sweaty Roman soldiers with their formations and discipline and other pretentious Mediterranean magic tricks. Most of the work was done before Emperor Claudius even arrived in person. And in the same year of 43 AD, the southern part of the island was annexed as an official province of Rome. Good luck, Claudius. I still need that homework tomorrow, though. But the natives' tale of resistance was not over yet, and in the first major event in the geography's history concerning the people actually from there, a people called the Iceni revolted against Roman rule in 60 AD. While the Romans were usually pretty benevolent for their time in their treatment of foreign subjects, the Iceni were dealt a bad hand, and their local Roman overlords treated them very cruelly. In response, the legendary Queen Boudica led a revolution that brutally sacked many Roman settlements such as Colchester, Londinium, and St. Albans. However, Queen Boudica couldn't unite her people against the foreign invaders. Roman officials would bribe other Britannic rulers and instigate them to move against the Iceni and their revolt. Without any sort of cohesion between the native people against this larger, more technologically advanced foreign threat, the resistance against imperialism was more or less doomed from the start. This story and lesson that is now ingrained into the land will be duly noted in the distant future. For now, though, Boudica and her Iceni were able to isolate the legion of storied Roman general Paulinus in the Midlands and outnumbered him and his men 10 to 1. The Romans were in the absolute tippy top of their prime, though, and Boudica picked a bad time to book the Britons' first big fight in the big leagues. In a fascinating display of defensive combat strategy studied to this day, the Romans completely crushed the massive Britannic army while suffering few casualties. Following this, morale for the Britons as a sovereign people more or less evaporated into thin air, and they would spend the next few centuries under Roman rule without giving too much trouble. While peoples like the Brigantes and the Welsh were especially stubborn, Rome had fairly confidently conquered the territory of southern Britain by 76 AD. The Romans were never able to gain a confident foothold in Scotland and Ireland though, noting the people there as especially rowdy, and the affair of subjugating them not being worth the effort. The juice just ain't worth the squeeze, you know? So yeah, Irish and Scottish viewers, the Romans had nothing on you. Your aura was just too insane. Go and tell every English person away with ya! In 122 AD, Emperor Hadrian built a big wall standing to this very day on the Tyne-Solway line, aptly named Hadrian's Wall. This was meant to mark the boundaries of Rome's ambitions in the Isles. And that about puts a cap on all the major events that are relevant to the island of Britain for our narrative. Not much happened here comparative to the rest of Europe. Even back in the Roman times, Britannia was the butt of military jokes about being a post where there's nothing to do. And this is all good and well, but I think it would be beneficial for us to take a closer look at life and culture in Roman Britain. Roman Britain was a unique province in the Roman world, the way that it mirrored the structure of the more modern sense of a colony rather than the ancient sense of a Roman province. Many Roman towns were established, with Londinium being the province's capital. However, within the towns, the populations consisted mostly of migrants from the Mediterranean and elsewhere in search of economic opportunity from exotic materials and cheap land. The composition of native Celtic inhabitants within these cities might have been fairly low. Rome established towns such as Colchester, Lincoln, and Gloucester. You know, I know that one is pronounced as Gloucester or like Gloucester, so I wonder how badly I'm butchering all these. Oh my gosh, no. But these towns were what is called coloniae, established exclusively for use by retired veterans of the empire. The Britannic elite built ornate manors that blended Celtic and Latin art and mythology in its decoration. But a wealthy Romanized Brit might have been an exception rather than the standard, but no one really knows. Roman towns had their signature Roman city planning and Roman advanced agricultural practices, but both were largely forgotten when the Romans formally withdrew from the island. This leaves a bit of an impression that the native Britons weren't invited to the Rome costume party. Again, the effect of Romanization on Britain's native population is hotly debated stuff that nobody has the answer to. But what we do know is that Roman contemporaries speak of the province like some sort of barbarian sightseeing tourist attraction. Also, archaeology reveals that rural sections of the island during Rome's long occupation had little Roman influence, remaining largely unchanged in their architecture before and during Roman rule. There does seem to be evidence of a rise of a uniquely Britain-based Roman ruling class, but whether they were actually Britons or transplants from the mainland with little connection or regard to the natives is uncertain. The province was wildly wealthy with its agricultural surplus, but as mentioned earlier, when you could see that the irrigated plantations completely collapsed as soon as they dipped out in the 400s, you get a bit of an impression that the prosperous Roman Britannia was an invite-only affair. Hey, you had to have known a guy. How many brothers do you know? Oh, you're from here? You're from here? Thought that would help you, bro? It's actually a deal breaker. Get this guy out of here. When Gaul was being completely overrun by Germanic invaders, the province of Britannia declared independence and hailed its very own Constantine as emperor. No, not the famous Constantine, just one of the many guys that was named after him. But in the early 400s, in a nearly comedic turn of events, Constantine rallied his troops and gave a passionate speech about how it was their duty to go and save their failing empire. They made plans, and nearly every single soldier on the island all boarded boats to leave for Gaul to fight the Goths and the Franks and whatnot, and that's it. Like, just straight up, they just abandoned Britain. They just dipped out. In 410 AD, Latin-speaking Britons wrote out a lament and a cry for aid to Emperor Honorius, as it was made abundantly clear to them that various Germanic and neighboring Celtic raiders were staring down the ungarrisoned Britannia and licking their chops. Glorious Emperor, wonderful Emperor of the West, Honorius, wrote back and told them that while the whole ordeal is so tragic, they were basically on their own now. And thus ends the Romans in the Isles. Following the departure of the Romans from the island of Britain, you then have what I argue is the most significant event in all of its history, the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. And by the Anglo-Saxons, I mean the Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons. But it really wasn't just them. There were the Jutes and evidence of plenty of Frisians and some stray Franks and their Vandal friend they met at summer camp, maybe even a deserting Goth or two, clinging on to the hull of the boat. And it started in the 400s and ramped up in the 500s. Like, just when the Romans left. These guys were just sitting in the shadows, rubbing their hands like Birdman in the sidelines. Just daydreaming about this for years. Like they jumped on this with some shot clock urgency. Wasted no time. Generational schemers. And then bam, they spread out through all of what we know as England, and the Britannic stuff was gone. The languages and practices disappear. Even the surnames of Britannic England ceased to exist, and the invading tribes established kingdoms loosely based on tribal origin. And we're on to the Middle Ages. Written history more or less ends at the Romans leaving and then picks up with the rise of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the 600s. Yeah, everyone is a Germanic duke with a lance now. What Britons? Let's talk about how cool Wessex was. Wait, what? What happened? What happened between 410 and the rise of states like Northumbria? What happened to the Celtic Latin Britons? I mean, they were there for centuries. Truth be told, there are little to no surviving records of the Anglo-Saxon migration. There's a famous book written around the period called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but it skims over the events, even somewhat pleading ignorance in its own way. Most Anglo-Saxons may have been illiterate, but certainly not all of them. And if tales of mainland Europe are preserved with some consistency through oral tradition, then shouldn't this major upheaval be at least somewhat of note? Why is there basically a whole century where nothing is remembered? The island was host to massive mansions and towns. While I previously mentioned that the Britons might have been cast to the fringe in the Roman world, there were certainly some Romanized ones with estates and memories of the empire and its ways. This would be exotic and stand out to a Saxon warlord. Why are there no stories? Oh yeah. While the Anglo-Saxon raiders of the time weren't literate, the Britannic elite most definitely were. And through them, we actually do have a couple surviving recounts of the events of the invasion. Here's the glimpse that they give us. Dated 6th century AD, Britannic scholar Gildas, on the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. Genzo dibulis, deo et hominibus, totem insulum ferro et igne vasitavit. Itaut nihil remaneret nisi multus est saxa, ubi etiam in temore et miseria habitabant. We've now stumbled on what could be history's most shrouded and chilling mystery. A ghost from the distant past that haunts England and breathes down her neck like a chilled wind on the bank of the River Thames. What happened to the Britons? And were there any left to tell us?